What? Mangs is making a positive video about Fire Emblem Engage? What's next? Is he finally gonna come around and admit that Revelation was actually good? No, that is the one thing that will never happen. Revelation is a bad game and it has very few redeeming qualities. Engage, on the other hand, actually has some of them. While I made it no secret that I'm not a big fan of the latest installment in the series, I think people sometimes overestimate my dislike of this game. My main gripe with Engage is actually that it's just kinda dead in the YouTube algorithm, so a lot of people aren't very interested in engaging with it, excuse the pun. But I actually think this game has some upsides, and in this video I'm gonna be pointing out what I think Engage did right. I also want to make this video because I feel like a lot of people's commentary on Engage, myself included, has gotten a bit samey. I feel like everyone just brings up the same points over and over: fun gameplay, cringe story, and that's just kinda what they play on repeat. In this video, I'd like to take a bit more of an in-depth deep dive and really get into the nitty-gritty of what the game actually did well. However, for all you Engage haters, don't worry, tomorrow I'll be releasing a video where I'll be talking about all the things Engage did wrong. So if you hate positivity and just want to listen to me tear into this game, you can come back then. For everyone else though, let's take a moment to appreciate what Engage actually did right. Starting with my first point, which is the animations. We're starting off with a bit of generic point in this video, but still one that needs to be made. For me, Engage's animations are proof that modern Fire Emblem can look good. I didn't hate the graphics of the modern games, but I always found that they were lacking that little something extra. A problem I have with the 3DS era animations is that the characters seem so light. They're floating around the screen like they have absolutely no weight to them, and it lessens the impact of even the most devastating critical hits. Engage, on the other hand, has a sharpness to it, and yet the characters still float through the air without seeming like they're made of cardboard. The animations are breathtaking. When one of your units scores a break attack, it genuinely feels like they are breaking a few ribs on the character they're hitting. While I do think some of the emblem attacks are a little too over the top and I get a little tired of viewing them, generally speaking, Engage has by far the best animations of the modern Fire Emblem era, and that is something that deserves praise. Along with my next point, which is the map design. Most modern Fire Emblem games have had really bad maps. This trend started in Awakening, and while Fates fixed it in some regard, Echoes took a huge step back, and Treehouses went into the ditch by having approximately 10 maps which got recycled endlessly. Engage does not have the best map design in the series, not by a long shot, but it's a big step up compared to what we used to get. There's actual terrain to work with, choke points where you can bottleneck enemies, and the scenery actually looks somewhat decent, with houses, bridges, and windmills. Man, there's a lot of windmills in this game. Now that we've gotten past the generic points, however, let's start by jumping into some specifics, like this next point, which is Armor Knights feel unique. Armor Knights being bad is a common trope of Fire Emblem, and yet they are so iconic to the series. However, I actually think this is a bit of an unwarranted point. I will say that Armor Knights have historically been pretty bad in the earlier games, but that's not really the case with some of the more modern ones. Still, the problem with Armor Knights persists. They are slow, and they also die incredibly easy to magic. The other big problem with Armor Knights is that if you train up a dodge tank with good offense that doubles and kills most units it goes up against, that's a lot better than just having a beefy Armor Knight which kills things very slowly. This is still the case in Engage, of course. Dodge tanks are amazing, but with Armor Knights being immune to the newly developed break effect, they now have a special niche that no other classes can replicate. While I still feel like this is less of an issue in the late game, it's absolutely crazy good in the early to mid game. When I did my first playthrough on hard mode, my Louis was the undisputed MVP of the party. I could use him to drag in tons of units, weaken them, and then have my other units come in and finish the job, which is exactly the kind of role I want Armor Knights to play in Fire Emblem. But Armor Knights weren't the only thing that Engage did right, and that brings me over to my next point, which is boss fights are finally interesting. With a few notable exceptions, Fire Emblem bosses have always felt kinda dull. They're usually located at the end of the map, sitting stationary on a throne or a gate, and killing them often feels more like a victory lap than an epic climatic end to a fight. The bosses themselves rarely have any interesting mechanics. They're usually just stronger generics with a portrait and some dialogue, and once you're at the end, you can just dogpile them with your strongest units, since they don't really come out to face you. Engage has finally found the solution to this problem by giving bosses multiple health bars. Sure, Treehouses sorta did this first with demonic beasts, but they never reused this mechanic for any of the humanoid bosses, which I think is a bit of a shame. I also love that most Engage bosses charge at you instead of just sitting idly by on their throne. When you pull an Engage boss, it really feels like a real fight is about to start, and you genuinely have to prepare for it. If you rush into it too soon, you might just get overwhelmed, and this happened to me several times when I played on maddening difficulty. I particularly love the fights in Engage where you have to go up against multiple bosses at once. It really turns into a proper boss fight that you really have to navigate carefully and use your resources to get through, especially on the aforementioned maddening mode. While I'm not a massive fan of the final boss fight against Sombron, as I feel like it has a lot of wasted potential, at least he's not just a single dragon that falls over when the protagonist waltz over to him with their falchion, which has been the case for oh so many other final bosses in Fire Emblem. A rare W for Engage, like this next point, which I'm going to bring up, which is the game's strategic depth. Fire Emblem is already a very complex game on its own. You have to calculate a lot of probability at once, take into account things like critical hits and unlucky misses, and even then, the most perfectly laid plans can go wrong if the numbers are not in your favor. Engage takes this and turns it up to 100. With the emblem rings, inherited skills, repositionals, and all the other different choices the player has to make, Engage is perhaps one of the most strategically complex games in the entire franchise. There is just so much available at your disposal. In fact, some people may think this is a bad thing. I've heard some players struggling with choice paralysis because of how many tools are available to them. I think this is something that can become more fun the more you play the game. So for those who really enjoy playing Engage, this is a definite bonus, which also brings me over to my next point, which is the game's replayability. The replayability of a Fire Emblem game is an often underrated aspect of its overall enjoyment. Some Fire Emblem games are really not that great on your consecutive playthroughs. Examples of games that are great fun to play once, but not several times, at least for me, are games like Fire Emblem Echoes and Fire Emblem 4 Genealogy of the Holy War. These games are amazing and offer a great experience on your first playthrough, but they're not exactly games you're burning to go through multiple times. Once you play them once, you've kinda seen most of what they have to offer. Meanwhile, a game like Fire Emblem Fates, which has multiple paths, a big roster of characters with a ton of customization, almost requires you to do multiple playthroughs to enjoy the games to their fullest. I feel like for the people who really enjoy Engage, replaying it multiple times is something that's both rewarding and fulfilling. There's just so many different wacky builds you can do with the emblem and bond rings. There are also countless paralogs in this game, and I feel like getting all of them on your first playthrough just isn't feasible. So Engage certainly got replayability, but that is further bolstered by my next point, which is this game is very moddable. I'm no expert on this topic, but based on what I've heard, some of the latest Fire Emblem games have been very difficult to mod. Awakening, for example, is apparently very sloppily coded and easily breaks apart. Every Fire Emblem game is moddable to a certain extent. Hell, I know one guy that specializes in making hacks of Fire Emblem 1, but based on what I've heard about Engage, it is actually very easy to make mods for, and there's already things such as randomizers, reverse recruitments, character model alteration patches, and a bunch of other cool wacky stuff available. If you enjoy playing Engage on the emulator or with a homebrewed Switch, there's a ton of cool stuff for you to sink your teeth into. And speaking of aesthetics, that brings me over to my next point, which is many designs in this game suck, but some are great. When we talk about Engage, jokes of Colgate and Pepsi-chan, Ivy's barbecue lid, and Celine's bondage dress are often brought up, and they are all valid criticisms. But there are some legit amazing looking characters in Engage as well, and I feel like they don't get enough credit. Gold Mary and Citrine are, in my opinions, two of the most beautiful female characters I have seen in Fire Emblem in a long time. Diamant looks so great that he should have been the main character of the game over Elir. Boucheron, while he looks a little generic, has that big chud energy I really dig, and I haven't seen a lot of characters possess it. And the same goes for Jade. Her armor lacks a bit of detail, but I actually think that's kind of refreshing in Engage, and I overall really like her design. Her long blonde ponytail is incredibly pretty. Chimera is also a very cool design if you strip away the stupid things in her hair. And another character that I think deserves a lot more recognition is Marin. I normally am not a big fan of the tomboy looking girls with short hair, but for some reason she just looks really good to me. Kagutsu also looks really badass, and while I think Panette looks out of place as a retainer from Somme, she could have been a great fit if she just came from Alucia instead. Yeah, the corpse bride thing is a little weird, but if they gave an explanation for why she looks this way, she could have been a great character. You see, there are great designs in Engage that deserves more praise and recognition. They're just drowned out by all the other bad ones. Sadly, when it comes to aesthetics, people are often way more likely to notice the bad over the good. Here's an example. If you set a perfect table with beautiful silverware and tasty food, but leave a giant horse turd in the middle of it, everyone who enters the room will just notice the turd. That's sadly how we humans are. We notice things that stand out. And bad things just stand out a lot more to us, especially when they're sprinkled in with some good. I'm not going to say that Engage's characters are well designed. They're not. But there are gems hidden among the rough that deserves to be praised. Another thing that deserves to be praised is my next point, which is Engage feels like classic Fire Emblem. One of my biggest criticisms towards Tree Houses is that it didn't really feel like Fire Emblem. The focus on the monastery, training up your units, and the removal of many important mechanics such as the weapon triangle made Tree Houses feel like it just wasn't Fire Emblem. Even though this game was an undeniable success, I personally was quite happy when I saw that Engage seemed to borrow more from Fire Emblem Fates than Tree Houses. I do think that the Emblem Rings dominated the gameplay a bit too much, especially in the game's later half, but Engage undoubtedly feels a lot more like classic Fire Emblem than Tree Houses did, especially when it comes to raw gameplay. I personally would rather want the series to go back to something more resembling the GBA era, but this is definitely a step in the right direction. Now, these are the points I could come up with on my own, but I know that I probably didn't cover everything, so I asked two of my friends, who I know have defended Engage in the past, to share their biggest gripe when it comes to criticisms of this game, along with one underrated aspect about Engage that they feel is often overlooked. Let's hear what they have to say.
Engage hate? It's bait. The number one gripe I have with the Engage haters is that the Emblem Rings are so powerful that they completely distort the difficulty curve and the balancing of the game. I don't find this to be true in the slightest. I think the Emblem Rings are actually pretty well balanced in regards to how many different approaches you can do to a map and to different play styles, which is really cool. It also shows you how the replayability factor comes in. There's never been a Fire Emblem game that I have replayed more than Fire Emblem Engage, which is weird to say, or that I felt more compelled to replay again as Fire Emblem Engage. As soon as I was done, I immediately wanted to jump into a second playthrough to see what different possible combinations I could make with my Emblem Rings in order to tackle the difficulty of the game, along with multiple different challenge runs that are accessible. One biggest complaint I have that people usually make as well is that the DLC completely shatters the curve of difficulty of the game. This is true, it does, but the reason it does that is actually because of the experience gains that you get from the paralogs that completely trivialize your comparative stat levels to the enemy by that point. The emblems themselves do make a big difference, fair, but they're not as big as the amount of resources that you get from those DLC portions. Mainly, if you played Fire Emblem Engage before the DLC wave came out and you did it on Maddening, I feel like you felt the true experience and the true balancing that went into the game. If you used the DLC, you saw the disparity and how much it could have affected your impact of the difficulty of the game.
Hello, I'm sure no one's surprised to see me here. So the thing I find most annoying about Engage criticism stems from large FE tubers who are aggressively negative about the game, but when the game launched, they played the game on hard mode. Now, I'm not just talking about Mangs. If you look at any of the large FE tubers that are aggressively negative about the game, they all played on hard mode on launch, with many of them also using DLC. They rushed through the game in a week so they could get their reviews out as fast as possible, which honestly is just not long enough to actually get a good feel for a game, especially playing on a difficulty that is lower than what is intended for someone with that much knowledge and experience. They then proceeded to tell their audiences that the game was bad and not to bother with it, and then turned around a month later with surprised Pikachu faces that no one wants to watch content about the game that they told them not to play. Notably, if you look at the FE tubers that did play on their intended difficulty of Maddening on launch, they are all the ones that are more positive about the game. Something that I think is underappreciated about Engage is its spin on the pair-up system. People often say, oh, I wish Engage had pair-up, but it actually does. Pair-up in Awakening and Fates usually revolved around having one main combat unit with a secondary unit as a sort of backpack. Now this backpack would give the primary unit bonus stats, which would then scale throughout the game as they built support. But an unfortunate trade-off for this was that secondary unit would be deprived of experience, deprived of weapon rank, and basically end up as nothing more than just a stat stick. Engage took this and implemented the ring system. in which you had these secondary characters that you could place as a backpack of sorts onto other units, giving them stat bonuses, as well as other things like skills. Now, these ring backpacks have no opportunity cost to using them, as they can't get experience anyway, but they still scale throughout the game thanks to bond rank. They then took the 5 skill slots from Fates and gave you 2 skills on your main character, 2 passive skills on the rings, and then 1 active skill in the form of like Astra Storm or whatever, making up the 5 same skills that you had in Fate. Engage built upon a lot of the systems that are in Fates, which Fates gets endless praise for, but you never see anyone ever saying, oh, Engage did a good job expanding upon this system.
So that's it. These are some of the things I think Engage did right. Do you agree or disagree with some of them? Let me know about it in the comment section below. And don't forget to leave that like and subscribe for more Fire Emblem. And remember, if positivity isn't your cup of tea, go check out the negative video on Engage where I talk about everything it did wrong. Once it comes out, it will appear on the screen right in front of you. My name is Finn Manx. Thank you for watching.